we all are touched by cancer and are eager to develop solutions for effective treatments, effective strategies for prevention, early detection, and symptom management. So what I wanted to do today is just give an overview of what clinical trials are, talk a bit about some of the ongoing issues and things that we and others are doing to address and enhance clinical trials, particularly in terms of the representation of diverse populations. So just to start out with, as you can see here on this slide, clinical trials are studies that are conducted for the purpose of improving cancer outcomes among patients. And what I think is really important to take away from thinking about clinical trials is that typically there's a focus, and I think our first thought is that clinical trials are only targeting therapeutics or developing treatments, but they actually are conducted across the entire continuum of cancer control, which starts with prevention, early detection, and includes studies that are done to identify and evaluate best practices and strategies for managing symptoms and treatment-related side effects. One of the things that I think is really important for us to keep in mind is that clinical trials are really important component for improving cancer treatments, reducing side effects, and enhancing early detection and prevention. And also, studies now have a greater emphasis on improving understanding the effects of treatment on quality of life. So it really is an important area for us to think about. One of the things that I think is really critical for us to understand about clinical trials is that they are not just for people who are not responding to treatment and who have advanced stage disease. And I think this is really important because I think, at least when I was coming up in my first experience with hearing about clinical trials, it was sort of framed as like your last option for cancer patients. And it really isn't the case. I mean, as I mentioned, clinical trials can be focused on early detection. They could be focused on cancer prevention across all different populations and stages of disease. So I just sharing with you a couple of examples. So the National Lung Cancer Screening Trial was done several years ago to evaluate the two different approaches for detecting lung cancer early. And with the result, as based on the findings from this trial, which enrolled individuals who had an increased risk of developing lung cancer but did not have a history of disease themselves, it demonstrated a survival benefit from low-dose computed tomography and for lung cancer screening. And as a result of this trial and many subsequent studies, which demonstrated not just a survival benefit for lung cancer specific mortality, but also a benefit, survival benefit from overall mortality. So as a result of this trial, there's now lung cancer screening has been implemented into lung cancer. It is now part of a routine practice standard of care for early detection of lung cancer, which is a really significant advance. Now there's a new study, Forte, which is shown here, which is a trial that's being done to evaluate alternative approaches for colorectal cancer screening. And then the final example shown here on the slide is focused on evaluating procedures for cryotherapy as a strategy for pain management. So just from these few examples, I think we can see that there are many different approaches for ways in which clinical trials can be conducted across the spectrum from early detection, prevention, and then into symptom management and addressing side effects. One of the things that has been really interesting for me to learn about is just the scope of work that is used is really builds the infrastructure for conducting clinical trials. So clinical trials are done throughout the United States and in other countries. And within the U.S., as it relates to cancer clinical trials, the National Cancer Institute is one of the primary supporters of this type of work. And as you can see here, there's sort of three different mechanisms that are used to conduct clinical trials, which include the National Clinical Trials Network, the NCI Community Oncology Research Program, and then the Experimental Therapeutics Clinical Trials Network. One of the things that has been really interesting in the evolution of the clinical trials program at NCI is the NCORE program, which is was relatively new. Before I was recruited to the University of Southern California, I was the principal investigator of one of the minority underserved NCORE sites in South Carolina. And what was really exciting and important about this particular program of research was that it was designed specifically to enhance the involvement of cancer patients and community oncology practices that were outside of the larger academic research institutions for the purpose of enhancing the generalizability and representativeness and access to clinical trials among more diverse patient populations and community groups. So that's really, I think, an important advance because we recognize that we want for all of the therapies, all of the strategies for early detection, all of the approaches for cancer prevention to have the greatest impact and relevance for all of us for all of us across the country. One of the things I do as part of my day-to-day is manage a research team. And what I want to draw your attention to is that clinical trials have a lot of infrastructure in place to ensure that they are conducted according to procedures and the protocol that's been approved. And the research team is really critical for ensuring compliance with the research protocol, ensuring that informed consent is obtained, and that people are making the best decisions about participating in studies and about, the initial decision and also continuing their participation. So for those of you who've been involved in a clinical trial, this sort of description of the research team might be, you might remember that. But I just wanted to draw your attention that it's really truly a team effort that, in addition to the individuals shown here, there's a strong desire and focus on including cancer patients as part of the team. So I've mentioned that the NCORE program is relatively new, a relatively new focus and component of NCI's clinical trials program. And one of the reasons why it was established, the thought process when it was being established was that there needed to be focused efforts on ensuring that there were ways to increase access to and participation of disparity populations in clinical trials. And I think what I'll say is correct myself a little bit and just clarify that, the goal for NCORE is to increase access. I think, as we think about participation, we certainly do want to see that patients are making an informed decision about participation, even if the decision is not to participate. But the goal for the NCORE is to improve access. And so I think that's a really important distinction. So some of the things that are important to think about when deciding to participate in a clinical trial is the potential benefits. Some of the benefits that have been articulated and described by patients is certainly the opportunity to receive a novel new cancer therapy. But some of the other benefits that have been described is really wanting to improve and sort of contribute to the larger effort, our larger national goal of reducing morbidity and mortality from cancer. At the same time, it's important for individuals to consider the risk for that the particular study has that accompanies deciding to participate. So one of the things I think is really important from the perspective of deciding to participate in clinical trials is that patients have information that enables them to understand the risk and the benefits as it relates to their own unique situation. So one of the things that is really important to do is have conversations with the healthcare provider team to understand what's involved in participation, how and sort of make, and that the decision is really one that's made without coercion or undue influence. I'll draw your attention to this graphic here. If you were to go onto NCI's website, you will and sort of search for clinical trials. There's a really important information that I think is helpful to give some guidelines about other more detailed information about things that could be considered as part of making a decision to participate in a clinical trial. Understanding the decision-making process and understanding the way in which patients are identified, it has it's been a focus for a number of years in the context of clinical trials. One, because we know that the participation of cancer patients is less than optimal. And as you can see here, the latest statistic is that maybe about less than 10% of cancer patients participate in clinical trials. Some of the reasons why that might occur is that patients may not be screened for participation. They may not be invited to participate or may decline participation in a study. And then the related to that, something that goes hand in hand with the screening and the being provided an opportunity or an invitation to participate is related to the eligibility criteria. One of the things that was a real focus and concern at this point is the extent to which eligibility criteria may not be reflective of sort of the sort of your typical cancer patient. So one of the areas in which I work is in chronic conditions. And so in some instances, there are eligibility criteria, exclusion criteria that may limit participation among individuals who have a history of diabetes or hypertension or cardiovascular disease. And one of the things that I think is being really sort of a topic of discussion is, well, are we making the eligibility criteria to the point where we're not allowing patients who are reflective of the US population in terms of their personal health history not eligible to participate? So this is something that I think was going to generate more conversation and more discussion, because at the end of the day, the goal for clinical trials is to really have the broadest applicability to cancer patients so that we all can benefit from the new therapies and new strategies for early detection and the new approaches for cancer prevention. Some of the work that I do focuses on African Americans as a particular group that has been underrepresented in clinical trials. So underrepresented is something that I think a term we could spend some time talking about, because it can reflect the extent to which there's a small number of individuals in studies. It can reflect the extent to which there are the number of individuals or the percentage of individuals who are enrolled in a study population is not reflective of their representation within a particular catchment area or in the US population, depending on what the frame of reference is. And then the last way to think about representation is whether or not the inclusion or the participation represents the distribution of disease risk. So there's been a huge amount of work which has demonstrated that African Americans have greater rates of morbidity and mortality, particularly from some forms of cancer. And so one of the things that we can have conversations about or discussion about is whether or not the representation of groups is consistent with the distribution of risk of disease, of risk of morbidity and mortality. So for that reason, there's been focused work on trying to understand, well, what are barriers and facilitators to participating in different types of studies, clinical trials included. This is an example of data from one of my previous work, which was really, I think, important because it demonstrated that for a study that was sponsored by a hypothetical study in this case that was sponsored, that was described to participants as being sponsored by the study, as involving answering a questionnaire, one where data would be used for current and future studies, and participants would not receive the results. Only about 31% of African Americans who were enrolled as part of a nationally representative sample said that they would participate in this type of study. And this was an important finding because it really sort of gave us some insight into the level of participation and some of the challenges and opportunities that might need to be put in place to improve access to or participation in precision medicine research. So this type of work, I think, has been really an important focus for myself and for others, really to help guide and understand the ways in which we can enhance diversity in clinical trials. The other thing that I think is really important for us is to think about how diversity can be improved in specific types of trials. So early phase trials in particular are really the foundation of developing new therapeutics. And one of the things that we know is that as studies that have limited diversity, it really can compromise the generalizability or the extent to which the findings are relevant to diverse groups. It also raises questions about the having equality in terms of the potential benefits of the research. And it is, and as I've mentioned before, it is important for there to be some representation among diverse groups in early phase trials to really inform the future development of cancer therapies. So some of the challenges that we know related specifically to early phase trials is that they tend to be conducted at academic medical centers and tertiary care centers because the infrastructure is already established and is in place. And that there are many sort of complexities involved in prioritizing available trials, and then the familiarity with different components of conducting these studies. So one of the things we're really excited about is we just received funding, and the Norris Comprehensive Cancer Center has received funding to focus on improving the diversity of early phase trials in Los Angeles. I seem to have left off the Angeles and the Los, so I apologize for the typo. But our goal here is to identify barriers, particularly focused on the referral of minority and underserved patients to early therapeutic trials. We're focused on the referral process because, as I've shown in one of the earlier slides, the process of identifying patients and referring them to clinical trials is, I think, one of the most important and rate limiting step of a clinical trial. So patients have to be screened and they have to be referred to sort of start the process of informed decision making and obtaining informed consent. So that's our first aim, is to really understand what makes it easy, what makes it difficult for patients particularly from minority and underserved groups to be referred to participate in early therapeutic trials. The second goal for this particular project is to implement and evaluate a strategy or intervention for improving referral and enrollment among minority and underserved patients. And this is being done as part of a demonstration project where our goal is to, in partnership with our patient advocates and oncology clinics and providers that are part of the Los Angeles County Department of Health Services, that we work with them to really improve upon and enhance the referral process at multiple levels. First, starting with the healthcare system level and the provider level by providing more specific and detailed information about open trials and ensuring that there's a robust referral mechanism in place and being used. And the last level, and probably the most important level, is at the patient level, to ensure that barriers that patients might experience are addressed through using patient navigation. And then the third aim is to understand the impact of remote clinical trials on enhancing enrollment and of minority and underserved patients. And this is the concept of having remote clinical trials is one that is really emerging in terms of a priority area in the field, because we recognize that participating in a clinical trial, it doesn't begin and end with signing an informed consent form, that there are things that need to take place. Patients have to be able to get to the facility. Patients have to go back home from the facility. There might be laboratory tests that need to be done as part of this clinical trial protocol. So one of the things that there's been greater recognition of is that, well, how can some of those study activities be done in community settings? So how can we work with community pharmacies or community radiologists, as an example, to enhance and remove sort of the barriers associated with transportation, the barriers associated with parking at a facility that has limited parking available. So the whole idea behind remote clinical trials is that it makes participation and completion of study procedures more easier for patients and individuals who are caring for them. So that's the third aim of the study. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of things that is also being emphasized more in the field. One is that I'll draw your attention to our patient advocates, who will play a key role in working with the investigative team, which is shown here. That includes physicians who have expertise in clinical trials, operations, population-based researchers, and those of us, such as myself, who do research in cancer health disparities. But really, I think the important opportunity for us is to partner with individuals who are shown here to really ensure that the patient's voice and needs are addressed as part of the work that we do. Because our ideal outcome from this work is that we develop strategies for enhancing the referral of patients to our early phase therapeutic trials, but that really sort of are patient-centric and patient-focused, and that's our ultimate goal. So so just to emphasize that point even more, is that we see one of the most important pathways for us to enhance access to clinical trials is by engaging patients in the design, implementation, and evaluation of clinical trials. So some of the cooperative groups and programs that support and provide the infrastructure for conducting trials, many of those groups involve patient advocates and patient advocacy organizations very collaboratively in designing studies and understanding the barriers and facilitators of implementation, and more importantly, evaluating the results and making sure that there's from a patient-focused perspective on understanding the results of the study. The other thing that I think is really important for us is that, related to the myth that I provided earlier in my presentation, one of the things that I think has been really important for us to think about is, we want to involve and engage patients in understanding clinical trials sort of earlier in the diagnosis and treatment. And I'd love to have some conversation around this, because one of the concerns that has been raised is that, the period diagnosis is treatment is very complex. There are many issues that patients have to think about, decisions that need to be made very quickly. There's one of the reasons that I think we haven't really had the conversation about clinical trials earlier in the diagnosis and treatment trajectory is because of concerns about overwhelming patients with information at a very critical time that's very stressful and challenging on a number of different levels. At the same time, I think one of the ways in which we can begin to address the myths about clinical trials as only being for patients at the later stages of diseases after treatment has failed is really to introduce the concept and the sort of what clinical trials are earlier in the diagnosis and treatment. So I'd love to hear from you about your thoughts about that. The other activities and actions focus on reviewing the inclusion and exclusion criteria for trials more carefully. That's one of the roles that I play as part of being vice chair of a health disparities committee and one of the oncology groups that is part of the NCORE program that I mentioned earlier. And this is really to ensure that there's not a systematic bias against patients or an exclusion for patients who have different chronic conditions. And we certainly don't want to change and conduct trials in a way that would have an adverse effect on patient safety. But I do think we are now at a point where, in the case of chronic conditions, most adults, I think the latest statistic that I saw is maybe 1 out of 10 have at least one chronic condition. And so, we have to think about sort of the pro and the con of how we develop inclusion and exclusion criteria. And then finally, one of the things that I think is really important for us to do as a community is to work more closely with diverse healthcare systems and community-based organizations. This is illustrated in the work that I mentioned in our partnership with the Los Angeles County Hospital. And that's, I think, is a really important step and example of how we can build collaborations and strategies and implement strategies and methods and procedures that will enhance and enable participation across different types of groups. So I wanted to leave you with a word of thanks for the opportunity to participate and to have a conversation with you and to share my email, just in case you think of something afterwards that you want to have a conversation about. And I will bring my comments to a close at this time by saying thank you again.